I had been sitting at home, flipping through a magazine and half watching TV, when my phone rang. The woman on the other end sounded frantic, almost too eager to secure a sitter for the night. Her voice, tight with urgency, made me hesitate at first. But the pay she offered was hard to ignore. "Please," she had said. "I just need someone reliable, just for tonight." I'd agreed, but as I hung up the phone, a strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. It was a babysitting job, nothing more. So why did I feel so uneasy? The house stood at the end of a long, winding driveway, hidden among tall, dark trees. It wasn't the kind of house you'd expect to feel unsettling at first glance. It was modern, clean, and neatly kept. But something about the place felt wrong, even before I stepped inside. The windows were dark and reflective, catching the last fading light of the evening sky. I felt a strange heaviness as I stood outside, staring up at the house. I knocked, and within moments, Mrs. Winters opened the door. She was tall and thin, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her dress, a soft blue, was elegant, but a little too formal for a quiet evening at home. Her face a mask of politeness, with just a hint of something unreadable behind her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I know it's last minute." The house was warm, but not in a welcoming way. The air felt stifling, heavy. The scent of lavender lingered, but it couldn't mask something else underneath. Something faint, like old wood or damp air. "No problem," I replied, forcing a smile as I stepped inside. Mrs. Winters gestured toward the staircase, but then turned to me, her voice lowering. "Before you go upstairs, there are a few important rules you need to follow." She handed me a piece of paper, the edges worn, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. The rules were written in neat, slanted handwriting. 1. Do not open the window in Daniel's room. 2. If you hear knocking at the door, do not answer it. 3. Keep the closet door in Daniel's room closed at all times. 4. Do not go into the basement for any reason. The list of rules made my stomach twist a little. "These are rather specific," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Winters' eyes flickered to the staircase again before she looked back at me. "Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." She didn't wait for me to ask anything else. She grabbed her coat from a nearby chair, gave me a tight smile, and hurried out the front door. The click of the door shutting echoed louder than it should have. For a moment, I stood in the foyer, staring down at the list in my hand. The rules felt odd. No, they felt wrong. But I couldn't put my finger on why. Taking a deep breath, I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket before heading upstairs. Daniel's room was at the end of a long, dim hallway. The door was slightly open, and the light from inside spilled out in a thin line across the floor. I knocked softly, pushing the door open a little more. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, his dark hair falling into his eyes. He didn't look up when I entered. "Hi, Daniel," I said gently, stepping inside. He didn't respond, just sat there, staring at the wall across from him. His small hands clutched the edge of the bed, his knuckles pale. The room itself was neat, but something about it felt off. The air was colder than the rest of the house, and there was a strange stillness to everything, like the room had been frozen in time. I glanced at the closet door. It was closed, just as the rule had instructed. For some reason, the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. "Do you want to play a game or read before bed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Daniel shook his head slowly, still not looking at me. "You can't open the window." The bluntness of his words startled me. "I know. I won't open it." She doesn't like it when it's closed, he added quietly, almost to himself. I frowned, my heart beating a little faster. Who doesn't like it? Daniel's grip on the bed tightened, but he didn't answer. His eyes flickered briefly toward the closet door, then back to the window. The silence in the room grew heavier. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock from somewhere downstairs, the only sound in the house. I sat down in the chair near his bed, trying to shake the strange sense of dread settling over me. "Are you okay?" I asked, unsure of what else to say. Daniel finally looked at me, his dark eyes wide and unnervingly calm. "She comes when it's dark." I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "Who comes?" He didn't answer, just turned back toward the window. The air felt colder now, almost suffocating. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside. But the glass was empty, reflecting only the dim light from inside the room. Minutes passed, the quiet stretching unnaturally. I found myself staring at the closet door again, the simple instruction on the list playing over in my mind. Keep it closed. But why? What could possibly be in a child's closet that would require such a rule? Without warning, Daniel crossed the room and stood in front of the window, his face inches from the glass. My heart skipped a beat as I stood up, remembering the first rule. Do not open the window in Daniel's room. "Daniel," I called softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please step away from the window." He didn't respond right away. My pulse quickened as I took a step closer, my mind racing with the rule. Why wasn't I allowed to open the window? What would happen if I did? "Daniel, you need to stay away from the window," I said, more firmly this time. Slowly, Daniel turned to face me. His eyes were wide, but there was something off about his expression. He stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged and walked out of the room without a word. He was already in the hallway, his small figure disappearing around the corner. I hurried after him, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I expected him to do, but the house felt different now, like it was watching us. As I followed Daniel down the stairs, the floor creaked underfoot, and the air grew colder. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Daniel was standing in the foyer, staring at the front door. His hands were clenched at his sides, his head tilted slightly, as if he was listening for something. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "She knocks sometimes," he said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the door. "But you can't open it. You know that, right?" I swallowed hard, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. "Yes, I know. Come back upstairs, okay?" He ignored me, taking a step closer to the door. My pulse quickened. I took a deep breath and moved toward him, reaching out to take his hand. But before I could grab him, he spun around and darted toward the living room, moving faster than I expected. I followed him into the living room, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. Daniel stood in the center of the room, staring at the fireplace. The embers from a fire long since extinguished flickered faintly, casting strange shadows on the walls. He moved toward the far corner of the room, where a small door was built into the wall. My heart sank as I realized what it was. The basement door. He just stared at me for a moment, then pulled away from my grasp and walked back toward the stairs. My legs felt weak as I stood there, staring at the basement door. When I caught up to him, he was already halfway up the stairs, his small hands trailing along the banister. He moved quietly, as if the house itself was watching him, waiting for something. Back upstairs, Daniel walked into his room without a word and sat down on the bed, his eyes once again drawn to the closet. The doors were still closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving behind it. There was a faint, almost imperceptible noise coming from it, like the soft scrape of nails against wood. I forced myself to stay calm, my eyes flicking to the window. It was shut tight, the curtains still. "Daniel, what's inside the closet?" I asked, my voice serious. "She is," Daniel whispered. The third rule said to keep the closet door in Daniel's room closed at all times, but I felt a strong, unnatural pull to open the doors. I had to see what was inside. My hands were shaking as I moved toward the closet door, and just as I reached it, a faint knock echoed through the house. My heart stopped. I looked at Daniel, who was now staring at the door with an expression that sent chills down my spine. The knock echoed through the house, soft at first, but unmistakable. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made my stomach twist. I froze, remembering the second rule. If you hear knocking at the door, do not answer it. Without warning, Daniel stood up and walked toward the door. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were drawn to the sound. My heart pounded in my chest, and I rushed toward him, grabbing his arm before he could reach the handle. "We can't open it," I repeated, my voice tight with fear. He turned to look at me, his dark eyes wide and unblinking. "She needs me." His words made my skin crawl. I pulled him away from the door, leading him back to the bed, but his gaze never left the door. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I looked at Daniel, hoping he would say something, anything to explain what was happening. But instead, he started running toward the living room, his steps quick and purposeful. "Daniel, wait!" I called, hurrying after him. I caught up to him just as he stopped in front of the basement door. The boy didn't hesitate. His small fingers wrapped around the door handle, and before I could stop him, he pulled it open. A gust of cold air rushed up from the dark staircase below, and an unsettling shiver rippled through my body. "Daniel, we can't go down there," I said, my voice shaking. But the child wasn't listening. His eyes were wide and glassy, as though something had taken hold of him, pulling him into the darkness below. Without a word, he stepped down onto the first creaky stair, his small frame swallowed by the shadows. I hesitated for a split second before rushing after him. I couldn't leave him alone down there, no matter what the rules said. Each step I took felt heavier than the last. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the smell of damp earth and something old and decaying filled the space. It clung to my skin, thick, like a fog that made it hard to breathe. At the bottom of the stairs, Daniel stood perfectly still. His gaze was fixated on a small, dust-covered table in the corner of the room. The single light bulb overhead flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that danced across the walls. Everything felt wrong, like the basement had been waiting for us all along. I stepped closer, trying to steady my breathing. Daniel walked over to the table, his small hands reaching for something resting there. When he lifted it, I saw that it was an old photograph in a cracked, weathered frame. His fingers trembled slightly as he stared down at the image. I moved closer, and when I saw what was in the picture, my heart skipped a beat. It was a photo of two women. One I immediately recognized as Mrs. Winters, his mother. The other woman looked almost identical to her, but she was younger, and there was something unsettling about the way she stood. Her smile was too wide, her eyes too focused on Daniel, who was a toddler in the photo, cradled in her arms. "That used to be my Aunt Vivian," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "She died in a car accident. Mom survived. She was always around me," he continued, his voice growing quieter, as though the memories were pulling him deeper into a trance. It was like having two mothers. She tried to be nice, spending all her time with us, but my mother didn't like it too much. She didn't like how much time she spent with me. A chill crawled up my spine as the flickering light dimmed even further. The basement felt darker, the air heavier. I took the photo from Daniel's trembling hands, placing it back on the table, but something made me turn toward the far corner of the basement. There, where the light barely touched, I saw something shift in the shadows. Then a cold, raspy voice full of bitterness cut through the silence. "She never deserved you." The sound made my blood run cold. I turned slowly, my heart pounding as the shadows in the corner began to twist and writhe, forming a shape. A figure. It moved slowly, as though it had been waiting there all along. Hanging from the wall, half hidden in the darkness, was the twisted figure of a woman. Her limbs were too long, unnaturally thin, her body contorted in a way that made my stomach turn. Her face was pale, sunken, and her eyes, black pits of rage and envy, were locked onto Daniel. "I've waited long enough," the voice hissed, echoing through the room like a venomous whisper. Daniel's body stiffened beside me, his breath shallow and shaky. I could feel the air around us growing colder, and my skin prickled with fear. The figure detached itself from the wall with a sickening crack, her long, spider-like limbs stretching as she moved closer, her smile twisting into something cruel and hateful. "It's time to come with me, Daniel," she hissed again, her voice low and filled with malevolent intent. Before I could react, Daniel's body began to rise off the floor, his feet lifting from the cold concrete, as though an invisible hand had pulled him upward. His eyes rolled back into his head, his arms dangling lifelessly at his sides as the spirit moved toward him, her twisted form looming over him. I screamed, rushing toward Daniel. But the moment I reached for him, a force slammed into me, sending me staggering backward. The cold pressed in on me from all sides, and I could hear her laughter. It was deep, menacing, and filled with satisfaction. Daniel's body convulsed in midair, his eyes now completely white, as the spirit tried to take him over. Her long, twisted arms reached for him, her bony fingers inches from his skin. Desperation clawed at me as I searched the room for something, anything that could stop her. That's when I saw it. An old vase sitting on a shelf in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. My heart pounded as I ran toward it, my hands trembling as I grabbed it. The label on the vase was faded, barely legible, but I could make out the name, Vivian Price. It was her. The realization hit me like a wave. Her presence had lingered all these years because she wasn't fully gone. She had never truly left. The ashes were more than just remnants of a body. They were the prison of a malevolent force that had waited for this moment. I clutched the vase tightly and sprinted toward the stairs, the wind howling through the basement as if the spirit knew what I was about to do. The cold bit at my skin, but I didn't care. I couldn't stop. I had to finish this. Outside, the night air was frigid and sharp, the wind tearing through the trees as if the world itself was trying to stop me. I stumbled into the garden, the soft earth giving way beneath my feet as I dropped to my knees, frantically digging a hole with my bare hands. The wind howled louder, and I could hear the spirit's enraged voice screaming inside the house. But I didn't care. I had to bury her. I had to end this. With trembling hands, I placed the vase into the ground and began covering it with dirt. The wind swirled around me, fierce and wild. But as soon as the last bit of earth was in place, everything stopped. The wind died. The air grew still. A heavy silence fell over the yard, and for a moment, everything was eerily calm. Then, from inside the house, I heard a piercing scream, sharp and furious. It cut through the air, filled with anger and pain, but just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. The night was silent again, and I knew it was over. I ran back into the house, my heart racing. In the basement, Daniel lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling. The shadows that had clung to the walls had disappeared, and the oppressive weight that had filled the room was gone. I knelt beside him, pulling him into my arms, holding him close. "It's over," I whispered, my voice shaking. "She can't hurt you anymore." Daniel's small body shook as he clung to me, but I could feel the tension leaving him, the fear that had gripped him finally loosening its hold. The spirit of his aunt, the jealousy, the resentment that had consumed her in life and twisted her in death, was gone, buried with her ashes.